The biting wind, sharp as 1,000 razor blades, whipped around him, tearing at the tattered remains of his suit. Snow, a relentless shroud of white, blinded his eyes and numbed his exposed skin. Below, the wreckage of the private jet lay scattered across the unforgiving alpine glacier, a testament to the brutal force of impact. Brandon Hale, millionaire venture capitalist, a man accustomed to navigating the cutthroat world of finance with effortless precision, was utterly lost. His leg throbbed with a searing pain, a constant, agonizing pulse that reminded him of his broken body, a stark contrast to the indomitable spirit that had always propelled him forward. Days, or perhaps weeks, had blurred into an indistinguishable nightmare of cold, hunger, and the haunting silence of the mountains. He had crawled, dragged himself, fueled by a primal need to survive, to return to the life he cherished, to the daughter whose face was etched into his frost-bitten memory. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Rescue, when it finally came, was a hazy kaleidoscope of flashing lights, urgent voices, and the blessed warmth of human touch. He remembered being lifted, carefully, onto a stretcher, the distant hum of a helicopter growing louder, promising escape from the icy clutches of death. Then, darkness claimed him once more, a comforting oblivion after the relentless torment. Months later, the world outside the sterile confines of the rehabilitation clinic felt alien yet intoxicatingly real. His body, once broken, was slowly mending, though a persistent limp remained, a physical scar mirroring the unseen wounds of his ordeal. The face staring back at him from the mirror was still his, Brandon Hale, etched with new lines of weariness, a gauntness that spoke of his near-death experience, but undeniably his own. He had lost weight, his cheekbones more prominent, and a new scar, a thin white line, bisected his left eyebrow. But it was him, or so he believed. The anticipation of his homecoming was a feverish dream. He yearned for the familiar warmth of his luxurious home, the scent of fresh coffee, the quiet comfort of his wife, Sarah, and most of all, the innocent embrace of his 4-year-old daughter, Zoey. Zoey, his bright-eyed, endlessly curious little girl, had been his beacon through the darkest days of his survival. Her image had sustained him, fueled his determination to fight, to live. The sleek black car pulled up the winding driveway, past manicured lawns and towering oak trees. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of excitement and trepidation. The front door swung open, and there she was, Sarah, her usually composed features contorted with emotion, tears streaming down her face as she rushed towards him. Her embrace was fierce, trembling, a desperate clinging that spoke of months of unspoken fear and grief. He held her tight, breathing in her familiar scent, a balm to his scarred soul. Then, a tiny figure emerged from behind Sarah, wide-eyed and hesitant. Zoey. She was smaller than he remembered, her blonde curls bouncing as she slowly approached. Her blue eyes, so like his own, were filled with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. He knelt, extending his arms, a joyful smile stretching across his face. "Zoey, my little butterfly," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion, tears blurring his vision. "Daddy's home!" But instead of rushing into his open arms, Zoey froze. Her lower lip began to tremble, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. A small, confused whimper escaped her lips. Then, with a sudden, heartbreaking burst of terror, she recoiled, scrambling behind Sarah's legs. "You're not Daddy!" she shrieked, her voice high-pitched and raw, tears now streaming down her flushed cheeks. "Go away! You're not Daddy!" The words, innocent yet devastating, hit Brandon like a physical blow. The joyful reunion shattered, replaced by a chilling silence. Sarah, her face etched with concern, immediately tried to soothe Zoey, whispering reassurances, attributing the outburst to trauma, to the shock of seeing him after so long. "It's just Daddy, sweetie," she murmured, stroking Zoey's hair, her gaze flitting between Brandon and her daughter, a flicker of uncertainty in her own eyes. Brandon, though hurt and bewildered, tried to rationalize it. Zoey was only 4. She had been through so much. The plane crash, his disappearance, the months of uncertainty, it had undoubtedly traumatized her. His appearance had changed, of course. He was thinner, scarred, and his hair, once perfectly styled, was now a little longer, unkempt. It was natural for a child to react this way, especially after such a long and traumatic separation. Yet, the words echoed in his mind, persistent and unsettling. "You're not Daddy!" Over the next few days, despite Sarah's reassurances and his own attempts to dismiss Zoey's outburst, a subtle unease began to settle over Brandon. Zoey remained distant, wary. She wouldn't sit on his lap, flinched when he tried to hug her, and would often hide behind Sarah, watching him with those wide, accusing blue eyes. He tried everything, toys, stories, even her favorite ice cream, but her reaction remained unchanged. Her fear, her absolute conviction that he was an imposter, was unnerving. Then, there were the other subtle shifts. Sarah, while outwardly loving and attentive, seemed to hesitate before certain gestures, a fleeting uncertainty in her touch that he couldn't quite pinpoint. His colleagues at the venture capital firm, while expressing relief at his return, treated him with a strange mix of deference and unspoken reservation. Their conversations felt slightly stilted, their laughter a little too forced. He attributed it to the lingering shock of his ordeal, to their own adjustments to his return. One afternoon, he was rummaging through his old desk in his study, searching for some financial documents, when he stumbled upon an old, leather-bound journal. It was his personal journal, filled with private thoughts, observations, and detailed notes on past business deals. He opened it, eager to reconnect with his past self, to find something familiar that would ground him. But as he read his own handwriting, a cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. The entries were undeniably his, detailing events only he would know, but the handwriting itself felt off. It was subtly different, the loops of the L not quite right, the slant of the H just a fraction steeper than he remembered. He dismissed it as a consequence of his injuries, perhaps a tremor in his hand, a result of the trauma. Later that evening, while looking for an old photo album, he found a small, framed picture of himself taken just a few months before the crash. He picked it up, comparing it to his reflection in the mirror. The scar on his left eyebrow, the one he had acquired in the crash, was clearly visible on his reflection. But the man in the picture had no such scar. Of course, the crash had caused it. It was a new mark. But then, he noticed something else. The bridge of his nose. In the picture, it was subtly wider, slightly more prominent. His jawline in the picture seemed a fraction softer, less angular than the one staring back at him from the mirror. He dismissed it as swelling from the injuries, a trick of the light, the gauntness of his face making his features appear sharper. He was thinner, yes, but could that account for such subtle yet undeniable differences? He rubbed his temples, a headache beginning to throb behind his eyes. He was recovering from a plane crash, a traumatic brain injury, months of starvation. His mind was playing tricks on him. It had to be. The next morning, driven by an escalating, irrational unease, Brandon decided to conduct a discreet test. He remembered a peculiar habit he had before the crash, a small, almost superstitious ritual he performed every morning. He would trace the almost invisible mole just above his right eyebrow with his thumb while contemplating his day. He reached up, his thumb searching for the familiar raised skin. Nothing. He tried again, tracing the area meticulously. It wasn't there. A cold dread seeped into his bones. This was something he knew intimately about his own body. He had noticed that mole since childhood. How could it simply vanish? He told himself it might have been removed during his medical treatment, perhaps a minor procedure he wasn't aware of due to his injuries. But the thought offered little comfort. He needed concrete proof, something undeniable. His fingerprints. He knew his home office had a small, secure fingerprint scanner, a high-tech security measure he had installed years ago for accessing sensitive financial documents. He powered up his computer, his hands trembling slightly, and placed his right thumb on the scanner. The green light flickered, the system whirred, and then a stern red warning flashed across the screen. Access denied. Fingerprint mismatch. He tried again, his heart hammering against his ribs, a desperate hope that it was a malfunction, a temporary glitch. Again, the red light. Access denied. Fingerprint mismatch. A chilling wave of nausea washed over him. His fingerprints were unique, unalterable. They were undeniable proof of identity. The man who had survived the plane crash, the man who had returned home, was not Brandon Hale. The realization was a crushing blow, stealing the air from his lungs. It was a surreal, terrifying truth that defied all logic. If he wasn't Brandon Hale, then who was he? And more importantly, where was the real Brandon Hale? A terrifying thought, cold as the alpine snow, began to form in his mind. Was the real Brandon Hale still missing? Or worse, was he dead? And if so, who had taken his place? And why? The man who now occupied Brandon Hale's life felt a cold, calculated terror mingle with his simmering ambition. He was Daniel Kessler, Brandon's jealous business rival, and the architect of this meticulously crafted deception. The plane crash, though accidental, had been a twist of fate he had seized with ruthless precision. He had been on a parallel flight path, trailing Brandon in a smaller, older jet, hoping to intercept a lucrative deal Brandon was closing in on. When Brandon's plane went down, Daniel's opportunistic mind had seen not tragedy, but a golden, terrifying opportunity. He had crashed too, a minor incident with superficial injuries, allowing him to be the first responder at Brandon's wreckage. What he found there was a Brandon Hale, broken and barely clinging to life, but still recognizable, and a dead body, similar in build and height, tragically caught in the debris. An idea, audacious and chilling, had sparked in Daniel's mind. He was a man obsessed with Brandon Hale, driven by a simmering envy of his rival's effortless charm, his business acumen, his perfect family. He wanted Brandon's life. And now, fate had handed him the chance. The ensuing chaos of the rescue operation in the remote Alps had been his cover. He had managed to switch their identities, subtly altering the dead body to resemble himself before the rescue teams arrived. Brandon, clinging to life, was left for dead, his true identity deliberately obscured amongst the debris. Daniel, with a stolen ID and a terrifyingly convincing story of survival, had been airlifted to safety. The months in the clinic had been a terrifying dance of deception. He had studied Brandon's mannerisms, his speech patterns, his subtle quirks from years of observing him across boardrooms and social events. The physical transformations were more challenging, but not impossible. The plastic surgeon, coerced and heavily paid, had subtly altered his facial features, softening his jawline, widening the bridge of his nose to match Brandon's pre-crash appearance. The scar over his eyebrow was a convenient consequence of the crash, a plausible reason for slight facial changes. He had even managed to lower his voice a few octaves, a subtle but effective vocal transformation. But the details, the intimate nuances of a life lived, were the hardest to replicate. Zoe's cries, "You're not Daddy!" had been a chilling jolt, a stark reminder of the fragile nature of his charade. He had dismissed it then, but now, the growing suspicion in his own mind, fueled by the fingerprint mismatch and the disappearing mole, gnawed at him. He was losing control. The carefully constructed illusion was beginning to fray at the edges. He stumbled from the study. The "access denied" message still burned into his retinas. The realization was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. This wasn't a game. This was a man, a desperate, ruthless man, who had stolen his life. He felt a profound sense of violation, a violation far deeper than any physical injury. He needed proof, undeniable proof, that would stand up in court, that would convince Sarah, his family, his colleagues, that the man they had welcomed home was an imposter. He remembered a set of old medical records from a routine physical he had undergone just months before the crash. They would contain not only his fingerprints, but also detailed measurements of his facial structure, his unique birthmarks, and perhaps even dental records. He had kept them in a fireproof safe in his personal vault downstairs. His hands shook as he descended the grand staircase, his limp more pronounced than usual. He had to be careful. He couldn't alert Sarah, not yet. He needed irrefutable proof before he risked shattering her world, before he risked exposing himself to this ruthless imposter. The vault was hidden behind a rotating bookshelf in his home library, a secret he had always prided himself on. He entered the combination, his fingers fumbling with the tumblers, the anxiety a cold sweat on his brow. The heavy steel door swung open with a soft hiss, revealing a small, climate-controlled room filled with meticulously organized documents, family heirlooms, and precious works of art. He located the small black metal safe where he kept his most sensitive personal documents. He opened it, pulling out the worn manila folder labeled Medical Records Brandon Hale. His heart hammered against his ribs as he opened it, his eyes scanning the detailed reports. There it was, in the Distinguishing Marks section. Small, raised mole, 2 mm diameter, located 1 cm, superior to right eyebrow. His thumb went instinctively to the spot, feeling only smooth skin. The mole was undeniably gone. He pulled out the dental x-rays, holding them up to the light. He knew his own teeth, the distinctive slight gap between his 2 front incisors, the small filling on his upper left molar. He peered closer at the x-rays. The gap was there. The filling was there. But then he remembered something else, a crown, recently fitted on a back molar. He opened his mouth, feeling the smooth, ceramic surface with his tongue. He looked at the x-rays again. The crown was not there. These were his pre-crash x-rays, yes, but the man who had returned from the Alps, the one currently living in his body, did not have that crown. His heart sank. He had undergone that procedure just weeks before the crash. It would be on his dental records, the ones created right before the crash, not the older ones. A fresh wave of terror washed over him. This imposter, Daniel Kessler, was not merely a good mimic. He was a meticulous planner, a master of deception. He had taken care of every detail, even altering his face, but he couldn't replicate the internal biological markers that made Brandon Hale unique. The dental records, the fingerprints, the missing mole, these were the undeniable proof. But how could he prove it? How could he expose a man who had so thoroughly erased his own identity and assumed Brandon's? The imposter was now surrounded by Brandon's life, his family, his friends, his colleagues. He was seemingly Brandon Hale. And the real Brandon Hale, Daniel Kessler, was trapped, screaming silently from within a stolen life, fighting for his own identity, his own family, his own existence. The realization was a chilling abyss. The true nightmare had just begun. The man now inhabiting Brandon Hale's body, Daniel Kessler, felt the walls closing in. The fingerprint scanner, the missing mole, the nagging sensation that Zoey saw through his facade, It all culminated in a cold, paralyzing fear. He was a meticulous planner, yes, but the human element, the unpredictable nature of a child's intuition, and the unyielding truth of biological markers were variables he hadn't fully accounted for. He had altered his facial structure, his voice, his mannerisms, but the core essence of Brandon Hale, the intimate details of a life lived, remained stubbornly out of reach. He remembered the real Brandon, broken and bleeding, left for dead amidst the wreckage. A chilling thought, a flicker of sadistic satisfaction crossed his mind. Even if the real Brandon had somehow survived, who would believe him? A man miraculously escaping the Alps only to claim his identity had been stolen by a dead rival? It was preposterous. Daniel had covered his tracks meticulously. The official reports confirmed Brandon Hale's miraculous survival, identifying Daniel Kessler as a fatality in the same crash, a tragic irony. Yet, the anxiety gnawed at him. He saw the subtle glances from Sarah, the questions in her eyes when he fumbled with a familiar family anecdote or misremembered a minor detail about their shared past. He attributed it to the trauma of the crash, the lingering effects of amnesia, but deep down, he knew she sensed something was amiss. The genuine emotional connection, the intimate understanding that defines a long marriage, was proving harder to fake than he had anticipated. His power, his wealth, his new life, it was all within his grasp. But the constant fear of exposure, the lurking threat of the real Brandon Hale returning, was a constant, suffocating shadow. He needed to solidify his position, to erase any lingering doubts. He began to subtly isolate Brandon's old friends, those who knew him too well, subtly hinting at their unreliability or past indiscretions. He increased his public appearances with Sarah and Zoey, staging perfect family moments for the cameras, eager to project an image of normalcy and undeniable identity. He even enrolled Zoey in an elite preschool, hoping the new environment would distract her, perhaps even erase her unsettling pronouncements. But Zoey, bless her innocent, perceptive heart, remained unconvinced. She continued to look at him with those wide, accusing blue eyes. He overheard her whispering to Sarah one evening, "Mommy, Daddy smells different now, and his stories aren't the same." Sarah, bless her weary soul, continued to dismiss it as trauma, but the doubt in her eyes grew with each passing day. Daniel knew he needed a more permanent solution for Zoey. He considered psychological intervention, a gentle suggestion to Sarah that Zoey was struggling with the trauma and needed intensive therapy to reconnect with her father. It was a cruel thought, a manipulation of a child's vulnerability, but Daniel was beyond morality now. He was a man consumed by the desperate need to maintain his stolen life. One evening, while Sarah was out, Daniel approached Zoey, who was playing with her dolls in the living room. He knelt down, forcing a smile, trying to project the warmth he knew Brandon always had for his daughter. "Hey, little butterfly," he said, using Brandon's familiar endearment. "Want to play with Daddy?" Zoey recoiled, clutching her doll tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "You're not Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My daddy has a happy laugh, and his eyes twinkle. You're just pretend." A cold rage flared within Daniel. This child, this tiny, insignificant child, was his biggest threat. He fought to control his expression, to maintain the facade. "Zoey," he said, his voice strained. "Daddy was in a scary crash. Daddy is a little different now, but I'm still your daddy." Zoey shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, my daddy wouldn't make Mommy cry when he thinks I'm asleep. My daddy wouldn't forget my favorite bedtime story. You're not Daddy, you're a scary man." Her words, so simple, so innocent, struck Daniel with the force of a thunderbolt. He had been so focused on replicating Brandon's physical appearance, his public persona, that he had overlooked the intimate, intangible bonds of family. He had forgotten the nuances of a shared life, the thousands of tiny details that form the tapestry of a marriage, a father-daughter relationship. He had overheard Sarah crying, yes, from the frustration of his subtle missteps, his inability to perfectly mimic the man she loved. He had forgotten Zoey's favorite bedtime story, a detail so trivial, yet so profoundly telling to a child. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Daniel. Zoey knew. Sarah suspected. The clock was ticking. He needed to eliminate the threat, to silence the whispers of doubt. He needed to convince everyone that Brandon Hale was back, truly back, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was either malicious or deluded. And the easiest way to do that was to completely isolate them, to subtly undermine their credibility until no one would believe them. He began to escalate his campaign of subtle gaslighting. He would misremember details of their past, then gently correct Sarah when she tried to remind him, attributing her memory to stress. He started subtly questioning Zoey's perception, suggesting her imagination was running wild due to the trauma. He proposed family therapy, but subtly manipulated the narrative to frame Zoey's outbursts and Sarah's growing concerns as symptoms of their inability to cope with his return rather than a genuine identity. Crisis. The tension in the Hale household grew thicker, a palpable unease that suffocated Sarah and terrified Zoey. Daniel, in his relentless pursuit of maintaining his charade, was slowly but surely eroding the very foundations of the family he had so desperately craved. The imposter was now not just a thief of identity, but a silent, psychological tormentor, slowly breaking down the will of those closest to the real Brandon Hale. And somewhere, perhaps, the real Brandon Hale was still fighting, clinging to life, unknowingly racing against time to reclaim the family that was slowly slipping away into a nightmarish web of deception. The real Brandon Hale, trapped in the freezing grip of the Alps, battled not only the elements but the creeping despair of his seemingly insurmountable situation. He had survived the initial crash, crawling from the mangled wreckage, his body a symphony of pain. He remembered a face, a familiar, hated face, hovering over him in the snow, a triumphant sneer on Daniel Kessler's lips. He remembered the sickening thud as Daniel had struck him, plunging him into unconsciousness, leaving him for dead. When he had finally roused, days later, weak and disoriented, the rescue teams were gone, the site cleaned, leaving only the brutal, silent mountains and the crushing realization that he had been left behind. His survival was a miracle, a testament to his indomitable will and the sheer stubbornness that had always driven him. He had found a small, hidden cave, protected from the fiercest winds. He had scavenged what little food he could find, berries, roots, and later, small animals caught with rudimentary traps. He had fashioned crude splints for his broken leg, enduring agonizing pain with gritted teeth. His mind, though plagued by doubt and a gnawing sense of violation, remained stubbornly focused on one goal: return. He had to get back to Sarah and Zoey. He had to expose Daniel. His descent from the mountain was a torturous, weeks-long ordeal. Every step was agony, every breath a burning effort. He battled frostbite, exhaustion, and the relentless hallucinations born from hunger and hypothermia. He finally stumbled into a remote alpine village, a spectral figure emerging from the snow-laden wilderness, his clothes in tatters, his body emaciated, his face a roadmap of scars and frostbite. The villagers, startled by his appearance, initially mistook him for a lost hiker, or perhaps a survivor from another unknown tragedy. He stammered his name, Brandon Hale, but his voice, rough from disuse and the cold, was barely recognizable. His identification, of course, had been stolen by Daniel. He had no proof, no corroborating evidence. He was taken to a small local hospital where he was treated for severe hypothermia, malnutrition, and multiple injuries. He tried to explain his story, the plane crash, Daniel Kessler, the identity swap. The doctors listened patiently, nodding sympathetically, then gently suggested he was suffering from extreme trauma and delusion, a common occurrence in severe survival cases. He was classified as an amnesiac, a man with no memory of his past, his story dismissed as the ramblings of a broken mind. His calls to the police, to his own corporate offices, were met with polite skepticism. "Mr. Hale returned months ago," they would say, their voices tinged with pity. "He is home with his family, recovering. Perhaps you're mistaken." He tried to argue, to demand they check fingerprints, dental records, anything. But without a credible identity, without any proof of who he was, his claims were dismissed as the ravings of a mentally unstable individual. The frustration was a burning inferno within him. He was Brandon Hale. He knew his life, his memories, his family. Yet he was powerless, a prisoner of his own stolen identity. He eventually discharged himself from the hospital, his injuries still mending, but his spirit burning with a fierce resolve. He knew he couldn't go directly home. Daniel Kessler, the imposter, would have already cemented his position, woven a web of lies around his family and his life. He needed to approach this carefully, strategically, just as he would a complex business takeover. He made his way back to civilization, using what little money he had, relying on his wits and the kindness of strangers. He avoided major cities, knowing Daniel would have eyes everywhere. He found himself in a small, nondescript town, far from the bustling world he had once inhabited. He secured a menial job, living frugally, saving every penny. He spent his nights researching Daniel Kessler, his past, his connections, his vulnerabilities. He studied every public image of Brandon Hale, meticulously comparing it to his own fading memories, searching for discrepancies, for the cracks in Daniel's facade. He saw the carefully curated photographs of Daniel and Sarah, the imposter smiling beside his wife and daughter. A bitter rage twisted in his gut. He saw articles detailing Brandon Hale's triumphant return to the corporate world, his renewed focus on sustainable energy, the very initiative Daniel had been so jealous of. The irony was a cold, hard slap. He knew Daniel's weaknesses, his arrogance, his obsessive need for control, and his tendency to underestimate those he deemed inferior. He would use these against him. But he also knew Daniel's ruthlessness. He couldn't risk exposing himself prematurely, not when his family's safety was at stake. He needed proof that was irrefutable, undeniable. He remembered the specific mole above his right eyebrow, a tiny birthmark that no plastic surgery could completely erase without leaving a trace. He remembered the small filling on his upper left molar, a distinct dental marker. He also remembered his personal vault, the one with the fingerprint scanner, the hidden medical records. If he could access those, he would have the undeniable proof he needed. But getting to them meant getting past Daniel, past the security Daniel would undoubtedly have tightened around the Hale estate. It meant risking exposure and, potentially, his life. Daniel wouldn't hesitate to silence him, to eliminate the living proof of his grand deception. He began to subtly observe the Hale mansion, from a distance, hidden in the shadows of the surrounding woods. He saw Sarah, her face often etched with a quiet sadness, a weariness he recognized from his own struggles. He saw Zoey, his little butterfly, playing in the garden, her laughter still bright, but her movements often cautious, her eyes darting nervously towards the house. He saw the imposter, Daniel, moving through his life, commanding, seemingly in control, yet occasionally, a flicker of anxiety would cross his features, a subtle tells that only the true Brandon Hale would recognize. He knew Daniel was losing control, that the facade was cracking. Zoey knew, Sarah suspected. He had to be their voice, their truth. He had to reclaim his life, his family, before Daniel's insidious deception consumed them entirely. He began to formulate a plan, a desperate, dangerous gamble to infiltrate his own home, to retrieve the evidence that would expose the imposter, and finally, reclaim his stolen identity. The stakes were higher than any venture capital deal he had ever closed. This was for his very existence. The chilling reality of being a ghost in his own life fueled Brandon's every move. He spent weeks meticulously planning his infiltration, observing Daniel's routines, studying the security systems he knew so intimately, yet had to relearn from an outsider's perspective. He moved with a quiet desperation, his mind razor-sharp, honed by the crucible of survival and the burning need for justice. He knew Daniel was methodical, but he also knew his weaknesses, arrogance, and a tendency to underestimate. He discovered Daniel had indeed upgraded the home's security. New cameras had been installed, motion sensors strategically placed, but Brandon had designed the original system, and he knew its blind spots, its subtle vulnerabilities that only the architect would be aware of. He also knew the habits of the security personnel, the shift changes, the moments of complacency. He chose a moonless night, the darkness a welcome cloak. Dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood, he moved through the shadows of his own property, a phantom in the familiar landscape. Every rustle of leaves, every distant dog bark sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was trespassing on his own land, a bitter irony that sharpened his resolve. He bypassed the perimeter sensors with practiced ease, slipping through the gaps he had intentionally left in the system's design years ago. He scaled the wall to his study, a climb he had often done as a young man, gaining entry through an unmonitored window on the second floor. The window, though locked, yielded to his skilled hands, a familiar click confirming his silent entry. He dropped lightly into his study, the familiar scent of old books and leather washing over him. It was a potent mix of comfort and profound violation. He moved silently, his limp barely noticeable in the darkness, his eyes scanning the room. He located the bookshelf, the one that concealed the vault. His hands, though still scarred, remembered the sequence of the tumblers, the unique feel of each click. The heavy door swung open, revealing his sanctuary, his personal vault. He quickly located the fireproof safe, his heart pounding. His fingers, still raw from the frostbite, fumbled with the combination. He knew this combination by heart, a sequence tied to his family's birthdays, numbers ingrained in his memory. The safe door clicked open. He pulled out the manila folder labeled Medical Records Brandon Hale. His breath hitched as he flipped through the pages. There it was, undeniable proof. The fingerprint analysis report from before the crash, clearly showing the unique whorls and loops of his true identity. And then, the dental x-rays, updated just weeks before the crash, showing the newly fitted crown on his back molar, the one that the imposter clearly lacked. Finally, the distinguishing marks section, meticulously detailing the small mole above his right eyebrow. The mole that was now inexplicably gone from the imposter's face. He also found a series of security recordings from his plane, a hidden camera he had installed years ago as a precaution. He pulled out the small, encrypted flash drive, knowing it would contain footage of the crash, and hopefully, proof of Daniel's presence at the scene, perhaps even his villainous act. This was the irrefutable evidence he needed. As he closed the safe, a floorboard creaked outside the study door. His head snapped up, his senses suddenly on high alert. Footsteps. Light, hesitant footsteps. Sarah. He froze, clutching the folder and the flash drive to his chest. He couldn't let her see him like this. Not yet. Not before he had a chance to explain, to reveal the horrifying truth. He ducked behind a large antique desk, holding his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door creaked open, and a sliver of moonlight illuminated Sarah's figure. She stood in the doorway, Her shoulders slumped, her hair disheveled, clearly disturbed. She looked tired, her face pale, the stress of living with the imposter evident in every line of her posture. She glanced towards the vault, then to the desk, her gaze lingering on the slight disarray he had caused. "Brandon?" she whispered, her voice laced with an undeniable tremor of fear, yet also a hint of desperate hope. "Are you in here? I heard something." He remained silent, his gaze fixed on her. The yearning to reveal himself, to comfort her, was almost unbearable. But he couldn't. Not yet. He needed to expose Daniel first, to ensure her safety, and Zoey's. Just then, a light flickered on in the hallway. "Daniel." "Sarah? What are you doing down here?" Daniel's voice, cold and authoritative, sliced through the quiet tension. "Is everything all right?" Sarah flinched, turning away from the study. I thought I heard a noise from the study." Her voice was hesitant, uncertain. Daniel entered the hallway, his face a mask of concern, but his eyes, Brandon noticed, were sharp, suspicious, scanning the darkened study. He walked past the doorway, peering into the room. Brandon pressed himself deeper into the shadows, barely breathing. "It's probably just the wind, love," Daniel said, his voice calm, reassuring, yet laced with a subtle undertone of control. "Go back to bed. You're exhausted." He put a hand on her back, guiding her away from the study. As they walked away, Brandon heard Sarah whisper, "He just feels different, Brandon. And Zoey, she's so frightened. I don't know what to do." Daniel's voice, though lower, reached Brandon's ears, chilling him to the bone. "She's traumatized, Sarah. And you're overtired. We'll get her the best help. And perhaps, my dear, you should consider some rest as well. You've been under immense strain." The subtle threat, the implication that her concerns were a sign of her own instability, was unmistakable. He was trying to gaslight her, to make her doubt her own sanity. A cold rage, pure and potent, flooded Brandon. Daniel wasn't just living his life. He was destroying his family from within. He vowed, then and there, that he would make Daniel pay for every tear Sarah had shed, for every moment of fear Zoey had endured. He waited until the house was silent again, until he was certain Daniel and Sarah had returned to their bedroom. Then he crept out from behind the desk, clutching the evidence tightly. He had the proof. Now, he needed a plan to expose Daniel, to retrieve his daughter, and to reclaim the life that had been so cruelly stolen from him. The next step was perhaps the most dangerous. Finding an ally, someone he could trust, someone who would believe his impossible story. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of pale pink and orange as Brandon slipped away from his own home, a phantom leaving Double E. His past behind, armed with the undeniable truth. He needed a place of safety, a place where he could analyze the evidence and formulate his next move without fear of Daniel's watchful eyes. His mind immediately went to a discreet, private apartment he owned in the city, a bolt hole he had kept secret even from Sarah, a contingency plan for unforeseen corporate upheavals. It was rarely used, completely off the grid, and perfectly secure. He reached the apartment by early morning, exhausted but resolute. The stark, minimalist decor of the unused space offered a strange comfort, a blank canvas where he could finally confront the terrifying reality. He spread the medical records, the dental ex-debile, Reyes, and the fingerprint analysis report across the coffee table, arranging them meticulously, as if presenting a case in a boardroom. The evidence was irrefutable. His logical, analytical mind, accustomed to dissecting complex financial data, now applied itself to dismantling the elaborate lie that was Daniel Kessler. Next, he turned his attention to the flash drive containing the security recordings from his plane. He hooked it up to a secure, encrypted laptop he had retrieved from the apartment. The footage was grainy, jumpy, but horrifyingly clear. He watched the final chaotic moments of the crash, the plane plummeting, the screams, the wrenching metal. Then, the silence. And then, a figure emerging from the wreckage, stumbling towards his broken body. Daniel Kessler. The camera captured Daniel's face, his triumphant sneer, as he stood over Brandon. It captured him manipulating the dead body, subtly altering its appearance, before dragging Brandon's unconscious form into a crevice in the ice, burying him beneath the snow and debris. The cold, calculated malice was chilling, undeniable. A wave of nausea washed over Brandon as he watched the scene unfold, witnessing his own near death and the chilling act of his identity being stolen. But beneath the revulsion, a fierce, burning resolve solidified. Daniel Kessler had not merely stolen his life, he had orchestrated his death. This was beyond mere business rivalry. It was attempted murder, a deliberate, heinous crime. He knew he couldn't go to the police directly, not yet. Daniel was too well established, too deeply entrenched in Brandon's life. His story would still sound like delusion. He needed an ally, someone powerful, someone who knew him well enough to believe the unbelievable. His mind immediately turned to Arthur B.A. Jenkins, his oldest friend and legal counsel. Arthur was a brilliant lawyer, fiercely loyal, and incredibly discreet. He was also a man who valued truth and justice above all else. But convincing Arthur would require presenting the evidence in a way that defied all skepticism. Brandon composed a meticulously worded, encrypted email to Arthur, using a secure, untraceable server. He didn't reveal everything in the initial contact, just enough to pique Arthur's curiosity and concern. He referenced a matter of extreme personal urgency, a breach of utmost confidentiality, and asked for a private meeting at a neutral, secure location he designated. A small, unassuming library he frequented years ago, far from the corporate gaze. Arthur responded within hours. His reply brief but concerned. He agreed to the meeting. The trap was set. The following day, Brandon waited anxiously in the quiet library, hidden among dusty shelves of ancient tomes. When Arthur arrived, his face was etched with a mixture of confusion and worry. He was a distinguished man, his silver hair neatly combed, his sharp legal mind always evident in his piercing blue eyes. "Brandon?" Arthur whispered, his voice disbelieving, as he recognized the scars, the subtle changes, but also the undeniable essence of his friend. "My God. What happened to you? We thought you were home." Brandon led him to a secluded corner, away from any potential eavesdroppers. He began to speak, calmly, methodically, recounting his nightmare. He explained the crash, Daniel Kessler's betrayal, his survival, his forced recovery, and his struggle to reclaim his identity. He laid out the evidence, the medical records, the fingerprint report, the dental x-rays, detailing each discrepancy with chilling precision. Arthur listened, his expression shifting from disbelief to horror, then to a grim determination. He examined the documents meticulously, his lawyer's eye missing nothing. When Brandon finally played the security footage from the plane crash, showing Daniel Kessler's cold, calculating actions, Arthur gasped, his face paling. This is unthinkable," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with a rare display of emotion. "Daniel Kessler. That monster. He tried to murder you, Brandon. And he stole your life." "He did," Brandon confirmed, his voice devoid of emotion, hardened by months of suffering. "And he's living it. He's with Sarah, with Zoey. He's destroying my family from within, Arthur. He's gaslighting Sarah, terrifying Zoey." Arthur slammed his fist on the table, a rare burst of anger. "We go to the authorities. Immediately. This evidence is irrefutable." "No," Brandon countered, his voice firm. "Not yet. Daniel has deeply embedded himself. He's manipulated perceptions. If we go to the police now, without a fully coordinated plan, he could discredit me, claim I'm delusional, a traumatized survivor, or worse, have me declared legally insane. He has access to my resources, my influence. He could turn this against us. Arthur nodded slowly, his legal mind already processing the complexities. You're right. He's had months to solidify his position. We need a strategy, a way to expose him publicly, irrevocably, without giving him a chance to retaliate. We need to lure him into a trap, Brandon explained, his eyes glinting with a cold, calculated fire. A public forum where he can't escape, where the truth will be undeniable. And we need to use what he values most against him: his image, his ambition, and his stolen reputation. They spent hours planning, their minds working in perfect sync, a testament to their long-standing friendship and professional partnership. They devised a multi-pronged approach, quietly gathering more digital evidence of Daniel's corporate malfeasance, leveraging Arthur's extensive network to subtly spread whispers of instability within the new Brandon Hale's inner circle, and setting the stage for a dramatic, public confrontation. The most critical piece of the puzzle was the Zenith Innovations Annual Gala, a high-profile event where Brandon Hale, or rather Daniel Kessler, was expected to give a keynote address. It was the perfect stage, a gathering of the city's elite, media, and key figures who would witness Daniel's downfall firsthand. Arthur would use his influence to arrange for a few strategically placed journalists, known for their investigative prowess, to be present, primed for a scandal. Brandon would appear, unexpectedly, with irrefutable proof, ready to expose Daniel in front of the very people he sought to impress. "It's risky, Brandon," Arthur warned, his voice grave. "Daniel is dangerous. He won't go down without a fight." "I know," Brandon replied, his gaze unwavering. "But Sarah and Zoey are worth every risk. He will pay for what he has done, and I will reclaim my life." The plan was set. The countdown to Daniel Kessler's exposure and Brandon Hale's triumphant return had officially begun. The stage was set for the ultimate corporate and personal showdown, a battle for identity, family, and justice. The days leading up to the Zenith Innovations Annual Gala were a tense countdown for Brandon and Arthur. Every hour felt like an eternity, knowing Daniel Kessler, the imposter, was still living his life, still charming his wife, still terrorizing his daughter. Brandon continued his discreet surveillance of the Hale mansion, observing Daniel's meticulous public appearances, his forced displays of affection with Sarah, and the chilling regularity with which Zoey recoiled from him. The more he witnessed Daniel's insidious manipulation, the more his resolve hardened. Arthur, meanwhile, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He subtly spread rumors among the city's influential circles about Brandon's recent odd behavior, the unusual changes in his management style, the subtle inconsistencies in his memory. He didn't accuse directly, but planted seeds of doubt, ensuring that by the time of the gala, the attendees would be subtly primed for a revelation, their perceptions already subtly shifted. He secured discreet access for two renowned investigative journalists, whispering just enough to ignite their journalistic instincts without revealing the full, explosive truth. Brandon spent hours rehearsing his presentation, not just of the evidence, but of his own narrative. He needed to be calm, articulate, utterly convincing. He had to convey the impossible truth in a way that resonated with logic and emotion, leaving no room for doubt. He practiced in front of a mirror, his voice gaining strength, his gaze unwavering. He was no longer the broken survivor. He was Brandon Hale, returning to reclaim his life. The night of the gala arrived, a glittering spectacle of wealth and power. The grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel was awash in the soft glow of chandeliers, filled with the murmur of sophisticated conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the discreet clicks of professional cameras. Brandon, dressed in a borrowed tuxedo, watched from a secluded balcony overlooking the entrance, his heart a drumbeat of anticipation. He saw Daniel arrive, impeccably dressed, a charming smile fixed on his face. Sarah was on his arm, beautiful but visibly thinner, a subtle weariness in her eyes that only Brandon would recognize. Zoey, in a shimmering dress, clung tightly to Sarah's hand, her small face pale, her eyes darting nervously around the crowded room. The sight of his family, so close yet so painfully out of reach, fueled his determination. Daniel worked the room with practiced ease, his charming facade polished to perfection. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and accepted congratulations on Zenith's recent successes, basking in the reflected glory of Brandon's accomplishments. He looked every inch the successful millionaire venture capitalist. The irony was a bitter taste in Brandon's mouth. The time for the keynote address arrived. Daniel, radiating confidence, strode onto the stage, a spotlight illuminating him as he approached the podium. The chatter in the room softened, attention turning to the man they believed to be Brandon Hale. Sarah and Zoey sat in a prominent table near the front, their faces a mixture of pride and quiet discomfort. Daniel began his speech, his voice smooth, authoritative, filled with the customary platitudes about innovation and progress. Brandon watched him, his gaze unwavering, a cold fire in his eyes. This was it. As Daniel reached the crescendo of his speech, waxing eloquent about Zenith's future, a figure emerged from the shadows at the side of the stage. Brandon Hale. He walked slowly, deliberately, his every step imbued with a quiet power, his gaze fixed on Daniel. A hush fell over the room as confused whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Daniel, startled by the unexpected appearance, faltered mid-sentence. His eyes, initially confused, widened in horror as he recognized the man standing before him. The color drained from his face, leaving him ashen, his carefully constructed composure shattering. The confident smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure terror. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brandon's voice resonated through the hushed ballroom, calm and clear, yet filled with an undeniable authority. "I apologize for this unexpected interruption, but there is a grave matter of identity that needs to be addressed." He walked towards the podium, his eyes fixed on Daniel, who stood frozen, his eyes wide with panic. "The man standing before you," Brandon declared, his voice gaining strength, "the man you believe to be Brandon Hale is an imposter. His name is Daniel Kessler." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Confusion, disbelief, and then a rising murmur of shock filled the air. Sarah, at the front table, gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes darting between Brandon and Daniel, a desperate, dawning realization in her gaze. Zoey, surprisingly, simply stared at Brandon, her wide blue eyes no longer filled with fear, but with a strange, undeniable recognition. Daniel, his composure finally breaking, lunged for the microphone, his face contorted in a desperate attempt to silence Brandon. "He's mad!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. "He's a madman, a disturbed survivor of the crash. Don't listen to him." But Brandon was quicker. He seized the microphone, his grip firm. "I am Brandon Hale," he stated, his voice ringing with undeniable truth. "And I have the proof." He held up the manila folder. "Here," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "are my original medical records, including pre-crash fingerprints and dental x-rays that will not match the man standing before you. Furthermore," he continued, pulling out the flash drive, "I have security footage from my private jet documenting the crash, Daniel Kessler's presence at the scene, and his heinous act of leaving me for dead and attempting to steal my identity. The two investigative journalists Arthur had placed in the audience sprang to life, their cameras flashing, their recorders capturing every word. Daniel, cornered and exposed, looked wildly around the room, his eyes filled with desperation. He glanced at Sarah, who was staring at him with a look of utter horror and betrayal. He looked at Zoey, who, instead of fear, now showed a glimmer of defiant recognition. With a primal scream of rage and despair, Daniel turned and made a desperate dash for the exit, pushing through the stunned crowd. Security personnel, already alerted by Arthur's discreet arrangements, quickly moved to intercept him. The ballroom erupted into chaos, a cacophony of shouts, gasps, and the hurried clicks of cameras. Brandon watched Daniel's desperate flight, a grim satisfaction settling within him. Then he turned, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the ballroom, finally landing on Sarah and Zoey. Sarah's eyes, wide with shock and unshed tears, met his. In them, he saw not doubt, but a slow, heartbreaking realization. And Zoey, his little butterfly, began to walk towards him, slowly, tentatively, her small hand reaching out. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice still small, but filled with a tentative hope that brought tears to Brandon's own eyes. He knelt, opening his arms. This time, without hesitation, Zoey rushed into his embrace, clinging to him fiercely, her small body trembling with relief. "Daddy!" she sobbed, burying her face in his shoulder. "You're really Daddy!" Sarah, tears streaming down her face, slowly approached, her eyes searching his, seeking confirmation of the impossible truth. He looked at her, his heart aching with the pain he knew she was experiencing, but also overflowing with love and a desperate need for her to understand. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me. I'm home." The truth, brutal and undeniable, had finally been revealed. The impostor was exposed, his reign of deception shattered. Brandon Hale had returned, not just to reclaim his name, but to heal his fractured family and rebuild the life that had been so cruelly stolen. The long nightmare was finally over, and the arduous journey of healing and of justice could finally begin. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of chaos and profound relief. Daniel Kessler's desperate attempt to flee was swiftly thwarted by the hotel's security and the waiting police, who, thanks to Arthur's prior briefing, were prepared for a potential apprehension. The scene in the ballroom, with its shattered veneer of sophistication, quickly transformed into a bustling crime scene as officers secured the premises and began their investigation. Brandon, his heart aching with relief as Zoey clung to him, held her tight, murmuring reassurances into her soft hair. Sarah, still trembling, slowly approached, her eyes filled with a raw mixture of shock, betrayal, and an overwhelming, fragile hope. She reached out, her hand tentatively touching his scarred face, her fingers tracing the contours of his jaw, as if to confirm his reality. "Brandon?" she whispered again, her voice barely audible. It's really you?" He nodded, tears blurring his vision. "It's me, Sarah. I promise." The process of proving his identity was swift, aided by Arthur and the irrefutable evidence he carried. The fingerprint analysis confirmed his claims instantly. The dental x-rays were a match. The mole, or rather its absence on Daniel, was a clear physical marker. And the security footage from the plane, though chilling, provided the undeniable visual proof of Daniel's calculated act. Within hours, Daniel Kessler was officially charged with attempted murder, identity theft, and a slew of other grave offenses. The news exploded across every media platform. "Millionaire's identity stolen in Alpine nightmare," screamed the headlines. "Imposter foiled at gala. The story, a bizarre and terrifying tale of deception, captivated the world. Zenith Innovations, initially reeling from the scandal, swiftly released a statement condemning Daniel Kessler's actions and expressing their profound relief at Brandon Hale's safe return, praising his courage and resilience. The first few days at home were a delicate dance of reconnection and healing. Zoey, initially hesitant, quickly reverted to her old self, her bright laughter filling the house, her small hand instinctively reaching for his. She chattered incessantly about her toys, her friends, and the stories she had missed. Her innocence was a powerful balm to Brandon's wounded spirit, reminding him of everything he had fought to reclaim. Sarah's healing was more complex. The emotional toll of months of living with an imposter, of constantly questioning her own instincts, was immense. She oscillated between profound relief and lingering trauma. Brandon spent hours talking to her, patiently answering her questions, recounting the horrors of his survival, and trying to convey the agony of being a ghost in his own life. He assured her that her instincts about Daniel were always right, that her doubts were valid, and that he understood the psychological torment she had endured. They started therapy, both individually and as a couple, to process the profound trauma they had both suffered. His return to Zenith Innovations was met with a hero's welcome, though a subdued one given the circumstances. His colleagues, now fully aware of the horrifying truth, treated him with immense respect and a renewed loyalty. He had proven not only his business acumen, but his incredible resilience and his unwavering spirit. He resumed his position as CEO, his focus sharper, his priorities clearer than ever before. He initiated a thorough internal investigation into any potential corporate espionage Daniel might have committed during his tenure, swiftly moving to safeguard Zenith's intellectual property and business interests. The legal proceedings against Daniel Kessler were swift and uncompromising. With the overwhelming evidence, he had no defense. He was convicted and sentenced to a lifetime in prison, his ambition and jealousy leading to his utter ruin. Brandon attended the sentencing, watching Daniel's cold, lifeless eyes as the verdict was read. There was no triumph, only a quiet, grim satisfaction that justice had been served. Life slowly, painstakingly, returned to a semblance of normalcy. The scars remained, both physical and emotional, but they were now marks of survival, of resilience rather than pain. Brandon dedicated himself fully to his family, to rebuilding the trust and intimacy that had been so cruelly fractured. He spent more time with Zoey, reading her bedtime stories, teaching her how to ride her bike, reveling in every moment of her vibrant childhood. He cherished every quiet conversation with Sarah, every shared laugh, every simple touch that reaffirmed their deep, unbreakable bond. The experience had changed him profoundly. The ruthless millionaire venture capitalist was still there, but tempered by a new appreciation for the fragility of life, the preciousness of identity, and the enduring strength of human connection. He remained driven, innovative, but his priorities had shifted. Family came first, always. Years later, sitting on the porch of his home, watching Zoey, now a bright and confident young woman, laugh with her friends, Brandon felt a profound sense of peace. The Alpine nightmare was a distant memory, a story told and retold, but no longer a shadow over their lives. He looked at Sarah, her face etched with the beautiful lines of a life lived fully, her eyes still holding that deep, unwavering love. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. He had faced death, battled deception, and fought for his very existence. He had been dismissed, replaced, and forgotten. But he had returned, not just alive, but reborn, with a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. The little girl who had once cried, "You're not Daddy," had been his saving grace, the innocent truth that shattered a meticulously crafted lie. And in reclaiming his identity, Brandon Hale had discovered the true meaning of home, family, and the enduring power of unconditional love.